Hello, my friends. I'm Dennis Prager. Thank you for being with me. One of the most intelligent of my regular, by regular it doesn't mean every day, of course, or even every week, or even every month, but people whom I've had on repeatedly, is George Friedman, founder and president of Geopolitical Futures. It's a private intelligence service which is available by subscription to people, and you can sample it up at DennisPrager.com. Again, the name is Geopolitical Futures. George Friedman, good to be with you.
Good to be here.
So you and I talk international affairs when we talk, so let me begin with this. Some of the greatest troublemakers in the world, and if you don't agree with my assessment of these regimes as such, obviously say that. I always tell guests, not an issue to differ with me. But if we would argue that Iran, Turkey, and Russia are troubling regimes in the world, they seem to be hurting right now as compared to the recent past. A, is that true? And B, is that good?
It is true, and I'd add China to that.
Yeah, I was going to add China, yes.
Serious problems. Good or bad, it's inevitable. I mean, these countries are rising and falling and moving about, and they're inevitably running into problems. They're facing the United States, which is, contrary to popular opinion, extremely strong and able to do a whole bunch of things. And they're all trying to figure out how to control the United States by various means. And they're failing, and the United States is hitting back. They hit back on the Chinese. They hit back on the Turks. They're hitting back on the Iranians. The Russians are getting slapped. And these countries are all hurting from that, plus their own incompetence.
So why isn't there a celebration of these events in the American and Western media?
Well, the story that's being told, the narrative, as they say, is that the United States weakening significantly and is losing its position as the leader of the world. That other countries, such as China, are rising and shortly to overwhelm the United States, and that countries like Iran and Turkey no longer worry about the United States because the United States is so weak. So the heart of the story is that, and this has been an older story than just Trump, but it's certainly accelerated since then. The heart of the story is that the United States is in decline, and therefore all these other countries are free to play.
Yeah, but that's the opposite of the truth.
Well, the truth is the United States is actually in fairly extraordinary shape compared to these countries.
Yes.
The Chinese are now instituting a dictatorship because they're so weak and divided. The Russians are reeling from low oil prices. The Turks are, well, they're not really on the verge of collapse, but they're hurting seriously. And the Iranians are facing an internal uprising. So when we compare the United States to these or the European Union, we're up to our usual tricks and enjoying ourselves, carrying on. But we're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, but they don't want to tell the truth because that might be pro-Trump.
Well, the problem that they have is they really don't understand the world. They don't understand what power is. They don't understand what it means to be the world's largest economy. They don't understand what it means to have the only global military force. They don't understand these things. They seem to go on reputation. And the reputation of the United States in their mind is plunging because of Trump. Well, even if it were plunging because of Trump, the United States would still have the largest military and the largest economy in the world. And it's not plunging because of Trump, because there are a lot of people out there actually in these countries I visit like Trump. The leaders like Trump. They did not like Obama because Obama was constantly preaching to them and undermining them. They like Trump because, for the most part, Trump leaves them alone. And they appreciate that.
You got to write an op-ed, George. You have a moral obligation to write that up.
I hate hate mail. I really do.
Oh, you do?
To kill me.
Oh, that's funny. I don't. I must say, I'm inured. I've been inoculated. But anyway, that's a very important thing. So let's talk about this. Another narrative, as you say, as they say, another narrative is that this president is just simply destroying the Western alliance. How would you react to that?
My reaction would be that the Western alliance collapsed a while ago, but nobody noticed it. An alliance consists of two parts, the alliance and its purpose, and a military force capable of sustaining it. The Germans have no military whatsoever, but they want the Americans to guarantee their national security. So here's the problem with this alliance. The Europeans' GDP, its economy, is a little larger than the American. There's no reason why the Europeans shouldn't have the same military force, except they don't want one. So my argument would be nobody has destroyed the alliance nearly as much as the Europeans did, and the only thing that Trump did was call them on it.
Right. In other words, the body is dead, but nobody acknowledges it. It's like the famous Monty Python parakeet, or parrot. I don't know if you know that routine. The guy brings back the parrot. He goes, "The parrot that you sold me is dead." Guy goes, "That's not dead."
Well, in this case, my story on this is Brussels is the headquarters of NATO, and they have really great dinners and cocktail parties, and they'd stop if we all admitted there wasn't NATO. So all the NATO officials say it's still functioning. Our problem is that we are a global power. We have interests in Korea, in the South China Sea. We have interests in Europe, in Poland and Romania. We are engaged in the Middle East. The Europeans are small regional entities who don't visualize the world. They think it's all about them. The United States is neglecting Europe because, thank God for once, nothing much is happening in Europe that we have to worry about. But the Europeans want to be the center of our attention. And when we aren't, then we're saying destroying this alliance. Well, our point is we've been fighting for years in the Middle East. We haven't had much support from these countries. They're irrelevant to the Korean problem. They're irrelevant to the China problem. We have serious issues. And their view is you can't have a serious issue that's more serious than us. And is that over and over again? They can't grasp the size of American interests.
In light of your views, which I share, I have been actually thinking, and I have not said this on the air, but so I'll just pose it as a question to you. Why are we continuing to keep troops in Germany?
Well, we already built the facilities. We want to have troops close to the Russians, close to the Middle East. We spent the money on the bases. It's not a bad place to go. We're not expecting any fighting there. But if you want to keep troops in reserve close to battlefields we do have, Germany's not a bad place to do it. Otherwise, you have to start building again.
I see. If this is a pure conjecture question. If there were a vote, and then I'm going to ask the same exact question about South Korea. So let me combine them. But there are two questions. If there were a vote, a plebiscite in Germany, should American troops leave or stay? How would Germans vote?
I think it'd be very, very close. And I think that it might even be that we should leave, which is why they're not going to hold a plebiscite. But if we left, it would be the end of NATO. And the elite wants NATO to continue to be there. Because remember, under the law, under treaty, there's something called Article 5, which if one country is invaded, the U.S. is legally bound to defend them. This is why Trump spoke about why are we letting Montenegro, a small Balkan country, into NATO. Because what he was saying is we are now legally obligated to defend Montenegro. And this is the Balkans. Who knows who will attack them? We're automatically in a war. And this
Slovenia.
All the jokes we make about NATO, this is the problem. We follow treaties. The treaty has the force of law. And the force of law says that if any of these countries are attacked or feel themselves threatened, we must come to their assistance. The Europeans keep extending the size of NATO, as they did the EU, And that means that the Americans, the only ones able to fight a significant war, our obligations are rising and rising. So when Trump said, why are we defending Montenegro? Everybody was shocked at his outrageous behavior. It was a very good question. Why are we now defending Montenegro?
All right, hold it there if you would. George Friedman is my guest. We will return in a moment. Hello, my friends. When I want to talk about the world, I talk to George Friedman, founder and president of Geopolitical Futures, which is a private intelligence service. And you could sample it up at the DennisPrager.com. So, George, I was asking you about Germany and South Korea, if there were votes there about whether or not American troops should stay. And your sense is that if there really were such a vote in Germany, it would be close, but it might well be that, especially with the younger generation, that the American troops should leave. Let's go to South Korea. What if there were a vote there?
I think it would be overwhelmingly that we stay. The South Koreans are not fools. They see the North Koreans north of their border. They would like to manage Trump a little better than he's willing to be managed. But on the whole, they have the North Koreans, they have the Chinese to the west, the Japanese, whom they don't very much like, to the east. And so I would argue that most Koreans, I've been to Korea several times, most Koreans are very happy to keep it the way it is while making their moves toward the north.
Let's go to Turkey. Why is the lira in a free fall?
Well, remember in the first place that Turkey has grown dramatically between 2002 and 2015, 2016. It had the same kind of growth rate the Chinese had. And like the Chinese, they just kept growing without the discipline of recession. Recessions help economies behave better by getting rid of weak businesses and so on and so forth. So they were going to go down anyway because they couldn't keep up that growth rate. The problem was the coup in 2016 kicked off a series of responses by Erdogan, who was trying to consolidate his control, that scared all foreign investors. Now, a huge part of the Turkish economy depends on foreign investment to keep going, not unlike the Chinese. But the foreign investment has dried up. You've got to be really crazy to want to invest in Turkey under these circumstances. And that created pressure until finally the economy started to crack and the lira went down. The problem is that Erdogan doesn't have plan B. He doesn't know how to get out of this fix because he's terrified that the austerity he would impose would make the people oppose him. And he's already got plenty who oppose him, but if his supporters started to be unhappy, his tenure might be short.
Okay, I got that. So let me understand. The decline is partially inevitable because they had such an upsurge, and partially it is a result of his mismanagement of the economy following the attempted coup?
No, I put it this way. The things he had to do in order to make certain that he wouldn't be overthrown ran counter to an efficient economy. He got rid of a lot of experts. He got rid of a lot of businessmen who didn't side with him. And most importantly, he frightened foreign investors who were critical. So I'm not sure he could have handled the coup any other way than he did. But having handled it that way, he's put the economy in a pretty bad position.
I just want to say, for my listeners' sake, and I'd like you to react, it is truly proof that people don't realize huge things. As a general rule, people don't realize huge things when they live them. They're only realized afterwards. And I'm thinking about how huge, and if you differ, tell me, but something huge happened in our lifetime in just the last 15 years or however long Erdogan is in power, 10 years. And that is going from a true bridge between West and Islam to becoming Islamist, a true secular state becoming a religious state. This is huge, in my view. Do you share that?
Yeah, but there's a reason. Whenever the Arab world was pacified, it was the Turks who pacified them. When we look at the Middle East, we look at the Sunni Arab world, it is normally in chaos. And the only ones who have ever been able to handle that is the Ottoman Empire, by being absolutely brutal and ruthless. Erdogan and the people around him think of Turkey now as returning to the Ottoman Empire. Yes, they're Muslim, but business comes first. And they also see the Arab world as a huge problem. So on the one hand, they're trying to satisfy the Islamic tendencies within Turkey.
Ooh, I think did we lose you? And we did. All right. I was about to say, when he said the Turks see the Arab world as a huge problem, I debated whether to interfere or not. And I was going to say, who doesn't? I mean, it's a tragedy, but the Arab world is a problem. There is tremendous amount of chaos there. We're obviously going to get George Friedman back. It's a very interesting thing. China wants to take its role as the Middle Kingdom. That's the word for China in Chinese. The Turks want to resume the Ottoman Empire. Putin wants to reestablish the Russian Empire. We have it's very interesting, and of course Donald Trump's motto is "Make America Great Again." So we have a lot. The Persians would like, or the Iranians would like to reestablish a Persian empire and hegemony. So you think about it, the world is composed right now of regimes that would like to reestablish these empires. We lost you there, George, when you were talking about the role of Turkey in the Arab world.
Well, I'm back. I heard you talking.
Oh,
I heard you saying about the Middle East. When isn't it a problem?
Yeah, but I also added, you might as well react. It's a fascinating thing to watch the world today. The Chinese want to become the Middle Kingdom, which is the word for China in Chinese. The Persians want to have the Persian Empire back. The Turks want the Ottoman Empire back, and Putin wants the Russian Empire back. Is that?
But the interesting part is they're all smoking hashish. They don't know how they're going to make payroll next week. I mean,
that is fascinating. So So in light of that, what conclusion do you draw?
Well, in light of that, I see the Eurasian Peninsula and as a whole in total disarray. I see the Chinese in deep crisis, the Russians in deep crisis, the Europeans in deep crisis. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, what we see is Eurasia destabilizing. What we see is North America, for all its problems, stable. So we're seeing a changing of the guard again, where all of the Eastern Hemisphere that we focused on is coming apart.
All right, I have a theory why, and I'm going to bounce it off you about that crisis. Okay, folks, we continue. George Friedman, Dennis Prager. Yes, indeed, everybody. Dennis Prager. George Friedman is the founder and president of Geopolitical Futures, a private intelligence service. You can sample it through DennisPrager.com. If you care about the world and understanding it, the man is clear, brilliant, and knows a staggering amount. That's why I have him on international affairs regularly. So we're talking about, this is a fascinating understanding of the world. I love the fact that you are a forest man. I divide the world between tree people and forest people. Forest people see the forest. We need tree people, but I like the forest. What is happening in the big picture? So you're describing the Eurasian collapse, as it were, and from China to Turkey, Russia. So and clearly parts of Europe, if not all of Europe, but not North America. So here's the question. Is the difference socialism versus more free market economy that we have?
Well, I'm going to be romantic and talk about our land. You drive through the United States, and you see vast areas of empty land that could be settled. And that's our wealth. It's land, labor, and capital. And we have the land, and we have the capital. You drive through China, you drive through Russia, you see vast areas of land that can't be settled by anyone. Europe, there's 350 Germans per square kilometer. We've got 35 per square kilometer, not counting Alaska. The difference to me is not only in the system of government we have, but the land, and that land makes our system of government possible. You can't be free when everybody's standing next to each other, either impoverished or with no room to move. We have room to move, and that allows us to have a capitalist system of government. And we're very fortunate of that, plus we have a regime that, for all its serious flaws, enhances that. So I always go back to this country, this land that we live in. And it's extraordinary. When you travel around the world, you see the tremendous difference, the limited space, the manner in which people squeeze each other just because there are so many of them. And then the United States. I go to Montana and say, my God, this should be a country of its own.
I'm sure they agree with you in Montana. Well, yet, having said that, Japan is packed, and Singapore is packed, and I mean, I know Japan has been a problematic economy, for about 25 years, maybe more, but nevertheless, when it was thriving, it was still packed. So, isn't it more an issue of system than land?
Yeah, but where does the system flourish? Japan was extremely lucky. It lost the war to the United States, and General MacArthur wrote the Constitution for Japan. And that allowed them to flourish. Would they have ever gotten there on their own? I don't know. Singapore is a special case. It's a city, not a country. But my point is that we're blessed with a country of extraordinary, not riches, but extraordinary space.
Right.
There are always going to be exceptions.
Right. No. I agree, but I still believe ultimately the values issue is going to be determinant because you and I rarely get into American politics, but so it's your choice whether to comment on it. But if we start giving everything for free like they think you should do in Europe and elsewhere, I don't think we will flourish, no matter how much land we have.
I agree. And when we have to ask the question, why do the Europeans behave the way they do? They're afraid of their own people.
Exactly. Yes. No. That's. Forgive me. That's what it is. The Europeans have such little trust in Europe that they feel they need to buy their populations, or they will become Nazis or communists.
Or rise up and behead them. Their history is the history of their population rising up against them. And they're afraid of them. And so they can't, and there's reasons. The land partly. They can't afford a system like we have. They're afraid of it. We have lots of room to maneuver to say to somebody, if you can't make it here, you can't make it. We're not going to help you. We don't say that enough, but...
Yes, exactly. All right, back with George Friedman in a moment. I got a new sponsor. Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here. Before I get back to George Friedman, I just want to remind you that August is the month we devote to fundraising for Prager University. The first hour I I interviewed two Romanians, phenomenal men, young men who brought me to Romania to lecture solely as a result of Prager University videos. which are seen around the world. 1 billion views this year. It's by far the largest conservative video source on Earth. It's one of the largest video sources of any type on Earth. And we're changing minds all over the world, but we need your help because everything is free. So if you want to help, just know that this week, whatever you give will be matched. Therefore, whatever you give will be doubled. Just want you to know that. If you give $100,000, it's $200,000. Wow! If you give $100, it's $200. If you give $20, it's $40. 833-PRAGER-U is the phone, or just go to the banner at DennisPrager.com. Back to George Friedman, who is the founder and president of Geopolitical Futures. It's a private intelligence service. You can go at DennisPrager.com and sample it, and I think you'll get hooked if you care about the world. So right now, you sound, I'm just inferring, you sound somewhat optimistic vis-a-vis the United States and the world.
I am. Everything in the United States somehow pivots around Donald Trump, and he's one of 3 parts of our government. But when you actually look at what he does, as opposed to what he says, which I've got to admit sometimes baffles me, he is a cautious, careful guy who takes risks at the right place. This China trade war, it's working exactly as he thought it would. And the Chinese are reeling from the effect. And I'm picking that as just one example. I mean, he said crazy things going to NATO, and then he got a bunch of countries pledging to go to 2%. So whatever...
Well, let me just explain to everybody, for me, pledging to go to 2% of their GDP toward defense.
Right. It means that they had pledged, and some of them, 6 of them, have moved to that level of funding, which means they're getting a military. So separate out what he does and what he says and what you think about his personality and everything else, because there are a whole bunch of presidents I didn't like. This one is stranger, no question about it. But he is oddly effective. And one of the things the media is not going to give him is that he is effective in achieving things. He went to Moscow and they asked him about something, about whether or not he held the Russians responsible. And I thought the media was absolutely irresponsible. You don't, while Putin and Trump are on the platform, ask Trump to say, did your host commit a crime? So when you look at the whole picture and forget the rhetoric and everybody carrying on, and we look at the world and we look at us, we're in pretty good shape.
How did you react to Helsinki?
I thought the AP reporter who asked the question was outrageous. I mean, you're on a panel of guests, you've got 2 people there, and you're asking one if the other committed a crime. Now, come on, what kind of answer would you expect to get? I thought the media handled the press conference very badly, and I think the media never once raised the question of did they behave properly. But I thought on the whole, what harm does it do to talk? And the liberals always said, let's negotiate. And now they've got a president who actually negotiates. He meets with them, and they're attacking them.
What do you think of the charge that he threw that on foreign soil, he said he trusted a foreign leader committed to a different set of principles more than his own intelligence agencies?
Well, since the left has been after the CIA, the FBI, and everybody for generations, for them suddenly to invoke them as the absolute truth. Look, I really don't know what Trump did or didn't do. So far, I've seen no evidence of any wrongdoing on his part.
Correct. I'm totally on board.
I see nothing, but who knows what will come out of it, okay? But what I will say that the media created a circus in Helsinki. The media behaved as badly. I've seen it behave badly, but normally at one of these joint meetings between 2 presidents, press conferences, they ask thoughtful questions. The question that came from the audience, from the media, was, Mr. President, do you think Vladimir Putin is a criminal? And Trump could have handled it better by saying, I don't think that's an appropriate question to ask at this time.
You know, when John Kerry would have press conferences with the foreign minister of Iran, did they say, Mr. Secretary, when they hang homosexuals here in Iran, what do you have to say about that?
And it's really important from my point of view in the work I do to pay very little attention to what he tweets, what he says, and so on. I look at what he does.
That's the mature way, in my opinion. Let's go to the Western Hemisphere, and the Mexicans elected they always elect. I mean, all of Latin America almost always elects people on the left, but this guy's on the left of the left. Any opinion on that?
Well, in the end, they still have to sell their goods to the United States. In the end, they still have drug dealers. And in the end, none of this yields to ideology or speeches. Obrador is a serious man. I think he has to be taken seriously. But he's stuck. I mean, he's an appendage of the United States. He must trade with the United States, and he must make his peace with the drug dealers. He won't. So it's sort of a non-story. They're not going anywhere right now.
Thank you, George Friedman. Hello, everybody. Dennis Prager here. I had to say a quick thank you to George Friedman because I wanted to take the last brief segment that we have here to speak to you. But he runs a terrific service. You should try it. And it's called Geopolitical Futures, and it's up at DennisPrager.com. Okay, so let me tell you something that will, in some of your eyes, render me a laughingstock. I'm prepared for it. I'm not going to lose sleep over it. As of this moment, anything can change anytime. As of this moment, Donald Trump has been a great president. Not a good president, not a very good president, a great president. Okay? You just heard from George Friedman, who's about as objective as you can get. And virtually everything he has done has worked. But, of course, none of this is reported because they hate him. The left hates him. I thought they hated Nixon. I thought they hated Reagan. I thought they hated Bush. By the way, they did. But this is a level of hate that I've never seen in the United States. It's almost homicidal. And I pray that is an overstatement on my part. The left is a very damaging force on earth. That's why these other places are failing. Most of you listening will live to see some very big upheavals in socialist countries, in big state countries. They cannot afford their system. All these promises from these new Democrat socialists, they're not possible. They cannot be done. It is a make-believe world where the government gives you, the state gives you, by taxing the rich, gives you everything you want. You want an education, you want health care, you want subsidized housing. Next will be subsidized food. Why not? If health care is a human right, food is certainly a human right. So what do? They can't afford it. So they either collapse economically or they bring in people who don't share their values, like Angela Merkel did in Germany, which has a dearth of people to support the socialist government. Okay, that's the story of the world. I'm Dennis Prager. By the way, you know how important religion is to me. I conduct the Jewish High Holy Day services every year. I've been for 11 or 12 years. If you want information, people of all backgrounds come. Send me an email at DennisPrager.com.
The Dennis Prager Show, live from the Relief Factor Pain-Free Studio.
Hello, my friends. I'm Dennis Prager. My guest is Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer is director of Jihad Watch, a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, where he is a Shulman Fellow. He's the author of 18 books, including New York Times bestsellers like The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and so on. And by the way, those politically incorrect guides are superb. Just every single one that I have read has been terrific. Just thought I'd give that plug. Robert Spencer's latest book is The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS. His knowledge of Islam and Islamic history is remarkable, and the book is a very important one. It is up at DennisPrager.com. Robert Spencer, welcome to my show.
Great to be here, Dennis. Thank you.
So, what's different about this book from your other books and from other books written about Islamic history?
Well, neither I nor anyone else has actually ever written a history of jihad before. It sounds hard to believe, but there is no other book that is a chronological narrative history of the entire phenomenon of jihad worldwide from the 7th century to the 21st, encompassing not just the jihad against Europe, which has been written about before, and that's all in the book in great detail, but also the really shocking story of the jihad against India, which is very little known in the West and I think needs to be better known. And also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is placed in context in this book as being part of the worldwide 14th century jihad. And 9/11, all the rest of it, this is the first time this has been done.
Let me just say that I have mentioned to my listeners, and which is one of the reasons I find your book so important. In my book, and I'm not plugging my book here, I just want to note this, though. In my book, Still the Best Hope, which is about Islamism, Americanism, and leftism, in the Islamism chapters, I noted that, and I'd like you to address this, the greatest Arab historian, some say the greatest Arab thinker who ever lived, admired universally, is Ibn Khaldun in the Middle Ages, and he wrote in his great book, the Muqaddimah, Prologue to History, Introduction to History, unlike all other religions, Islam is greater because it forces people by the sword to accept it. Am I correct?
Oh, yes, you're absolutely right. And I've quoted that in some of my other books. And really, this book now is an illustration of how Muslims have known that and have taken that seriously throughout history. And obviously, we have to add the eternal caveat. It's not all Muslims. But the book also shows that those who have not waged jihad have never risen up in any organized movement to stop those who have been waging it. And there have been throughout history for 14 centuries now, in every age, in every place, Muslims who believe that they have a responsibility before the divine being to wage war against and subjugate those who do not believe as they do and to bring them under the sway of their political system.
That's what I think Westerners don't understand, because I guess I'll put this in form of a question. If it's so obvious and so true, why is there such ignorance of this?
Well, there's, I think, an organized campaign of disinformation that is very sophisticated, and it operates on so many different levels. I mean, for example, I wrote a book about 10 years ago, The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran. And many, many people will say, oh, see, you're just cherry-picking verses out of the Quran. They're bad verses in the Bible, and so on. And so then you turn to Muhammad, and people say essentially the same thing. I wrote a biography, The Truth About Muhammad. And now, with the history of jihad, what I'm trying to do is counter the same kind of disinformation that comes about in regard to history, with particular emphasis on trying to change public policy. For example, Akbar Ahmed is a respected professor. He's 75 years old, laden with honors, professor at American University. He's recently written a book about Islam in Europe, full of historical whitewashes. And the obvious intent, and he even is actually quite explicit about that the purpose of his book is to get people to accept mass Muslim migration into Europe, and he's rewriting history to do so. And that's why I think most Americans have no idea of any of this, because they keep being told the opposite and keep being told untruths that are designed to get them to accept a particular political agenda.
By the way, I'm speaking, of course, to Robert Spencer. His book is The History of Jihad. It's actually published 2 days ago. It's a very important book, and it's just filled with footnotes to substantiate what he speaks of. I had a dialogue debate with the head of the Muslim Public Affairs, what is it, coalition or
Muslim Public Affairs Council?
Yeah, council. That's it. Yes, that's right. Yes, and it was very interesting. I said, and there were Muslims in the audience at a university in Southern California, and I said, the fact is, Islam has not been a religion of peace. And the reason that I mention this to you and to my audience is that if said without rancor, you could pretty much say anything. The people who really will yell at you, ironically, are the Westerners who want to do whitewashing. He said, well, he didn't fully agree, but he didn't find it, and it wasn't meant to be offensive. It was meant to just tell the truth. Islam has not been a religion of peace. It has overwhelmingly been a religion of war.
Yes.
And
there's no doubt about that.
Right. Well, but I just want people to understand you're allowed to say this you're not a Muslim hater if you say this.
Well, I have to say in this case, Dennis, that I have worked for 20-some years now without rancor, trying to be as scrupulously accurate as possible and as unemotional and not manipulative in the slightest degree in saying these things, setting out the evidence, as I do in this book, and have been labeled with all these things, all these charges. I think that the charges themselves of hating Muslims, of Islamophobia, racism, all the rest of it, they're a tactic designed to bamboozle people who are uninformed into thinking this is somebody I better stay away from.
Yes, that's right. That's why I wanted you to react, because I know it applies to you. 1-8-PRAGER-776 is the number. Robert Spencer is my guest. The other thing you mentioned that I'd also like to react to is what happened in India. And I cited this as well in my Islamism chapters in my book. And I was stunned. I was stunned by two things. One, the numbers of Hindus killed in the 1,000-year reign of Islam over India. I want to know what number you came up with. I won't say the number that I did. Number two, how it is not written about almost anywhere, including India. Would you react to both? What numbers do you have? And the non-mentioning of it in India as well as anywhere else?
Well, I have to preface by saying, of course, that we have to be a little bit cautious with the numbers because we're going back to the 7th century, and of course, reliable data in terms of the numbers is hard to come by. A lot of times these things are embellished and so on. But it does appear that it was in tens of millions, and the historian Conrad Elst, whose work is excellent about India, including the jihad against India, a Dutch historian, he has said that as many as 80 million people have been killed in jihad activity in India. And I think that as I documented in the book, the jihad against India century by century by century, and I use Muslim historians, by the way. A lot of the Mughal emperors and other emperors of the Islamic rule in India, they employed court historians, as of course they did in Europe as well. And the court historians would write the history of what was going on essentially as it happened. They were right there. And they write with great enthusiasm and great pleasure about the various Muslim emperors in India destroying thousands upon thousands of Hindu temples, carrying off the wealth, enslaving tens of thousands of people. And this happened century after century. The jihad in India was especially brutal because the Quran has a designation of the people of the book for Jews and Christians primarily, also Zoroastrians and some others. And the Hindus were not people of the book. They were very early on given this status because the people of the book can choose to be subjugated under Islamic law and denied basic rights, but they can still practice.
Right, all right, hold it there. This is really important. The book is up at DennisPrager.com, The History of Jihad. All right, everybody, I'm going to be back with Robert Spencer in a moment. The book is The History of Jihad. This man knows a great deal about the subject. That's why I'm having him on. I'd just like to remind you that Dinesh D'Souza's movie, Death of a Nation, is out. And as words like racist and fascist get tossed around to describe President Trump and Republicans, this movie asks the historical question, who were and are the real racists in America? Who were the real fascists? D'Souza's film takes you on a journey through time to answer these questions. It unmasks the real story of slavery, segregation, racism, the party behind it. This is an educational and entertaining at the same time film. Death of a Nation. And it's out in theaters now. Just want to remind you it's PG-13, and you can get tickets. For more information or to see the trailer, go to deathofanationmovie.com, deathofanationmovie.com, Dinesh D'Souza's latest movie. All right, Robert Spencer, the author of The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS. So I had asked you about India, and you were talking about the different status that Hindus had from Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, who could be protected if they desired to live in a second-class role and be subjugated to taxation and humiliation and all that. They're known as dhimmi. Okay, so the number you gave, the estimate of the number of Hindus over 1,000 years killed by the Muslim rulers there, you have accepted the approximate number of 80 million. That is the number I think I wrote as well, and that was from a Hindu historian. So before you get to Hindus in a lower status than Jews and Christians, tell me if you have a theory, or maybe I'm just wrong. That's a staggering number. Even if half is correct, it's staggering. Why does no one know about it?
I think no one knows about it because it's politically inexpedient for so many people for it to be known. And nowadays, even the Hindus in India and the leadership in India, they don't want this out because they have a sizable and growing Muslim minority, and they want to foster harmony between the two communities. That's a laudable goal, to be sure, but I'd never agree with people who think that it can best be achieved by accepting comfortable falsehoods. But I think that is one of the reasons why. And because there is a concerted campaign, I mentioned Akbar Ahmed before, and he's just one of these revisionist historians who are portraying Islamic history as being one of tolerance and peace and magnanimity throughout history. And that is, again, is in service of a contemporary, modern-day political agenda. But because most people don't have any idea about what is in history at all, and most Americans really, frankly, don't care about history, and they're easily manipulated in this way. There's a professor at Rutgers, Audrey Truschke, and she's written a book about Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was one of the emperors, the Islamic rulers in India, who was viciously, violently oppressive to the Hindus, destroyed thousands of temples, and killed untold numbers of people solely because they were non-Muslim. And she portrays Aurangzeb as some sort of a 16th century Gandhi, loving and magnanimous and kind to his non-Muslim subjects. There's not a particle of truth to that. And yet she is a respected academic and is invited to speak everywhere, including in India. And I think it's because people would rather believe that, in many cases, than actually confront the reality that Aurangzeb was probably one of the greatest villains of all time and ought to be ranked up there with people like Hitler and Stalin in terms of killing people.
It's a painful realization. Why don't you define jihad?
Jihad means struggle. And there are just as many struggles in Arabic that are used, that the word jihad is applied to, as there are in English. You know, you can struggle to lose weight or quit smoking or have a great civilizational struggle, and it's the same word. The Department of the Islamic Republic of Iran, rather, they have a Department of Agricultural Jihad. It's a bureaucratic office. It doesn't mean blowing up things on the farm. It means trying to increase crop yields, the struggle to make the farms more efficient. But in Islamic law and Islamic theology, the primary meaning of jihad is warfare against unbelievers in order to establish the rule of Islamic law. And as I show in the book, this is the meaning that Muslims, great numbers of Muslims, have understood throughout history and have applied. Now, many who are listening might think, oh, no, Muhammad said that the greater jihad was the spiritual struggle, and that is a tradition within Islam. But to give you an idea of how important that is vis-a-vis the jihad that is warfare, there is a manual of Islamic law that is published by Al-Azhar University that is, of course, the place where Obama gave his great outreach to the Muslim world speech in 2009. It's the most respected institution in Sunni Islam. And Al-Azhar, in this manual of Islamic law, they devote one paragraph to the greater jihad, the inner spiritual struggle, and then 10 pages to the lesser jihad, that is warfare against unbelievers, giving the rules of war, the rules for prisoners, the spoils of war, and so on.
In your understanding, is a religious Muslim, a devout Muslim, obligated with the obvious addition of the words "when possible"? It's not always possible. Is he as obligated to bring people, if necessary by force, to Islam as to fast during Ramadan?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But it's not necessarily to make them convert, because there is that third option for the people of the book, to be subjugated.
No, I understand. That's fair. So I should have said with the exception of Jews and Christians. Fine. Who would be subjugated. Okay. So, but the obligation to wage the lesser jihad is, in your understanding of Islamic law, as obligatory as fasting on Ramadan.
But not necessarily always in a violent manner. And one of the most remarkable developments of the 21st century, as I show in the book, is the development of jihad by means of very different tactics than just warfare, and the subversion and the infiltration of the West by Islamic entities that have the same goal as violent jihad, that is to establish the hegemony of Islamic law. That is something we haven't seen in history before, but it's a really remarkably effective tactic for bringing down a foe that is vastly more powerful militarily.
Is the aim, as you understand it, is the aim to bring all societies under Sharia, or is it to make all humans Muslims? And third, I guess, question is that the same thing?
No, it's not the same thing, and the aim is indeed the first one that you noted, to bring all of society.
All right, tell me. This is very important to me. Hey, everybody. Dennis Prager here. My guest is Robert Spencer of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the director of Jihad Watch. The History of Jihad is his book. The man is an encyclopedia of Islamic history. So, again, this is so important. So, a Muslim is obligated to engage in jihad. Jihad may be violent or nonviolent, but again, my question is what is the end purpose of jihad? Is it to bring all societies under the rule of Sharia, or is it to make everyone a Muslim? Or is that the same thing?
It's to bring all societies under the rule of Sharia. It's not until the end times, according to Islamic prophecies, that everybody will become Muslim or be killed. Jesus will return, and he is going to break all the crosses, kill the pigs, and abolish the jizya, which is the tax that the people of the book pay for their subjugated status, and everybody will be Islamic or dead.
So what is I am a good person, and I am a devout Muslim. or I want to be a good person and I want to be a devout Muslim, what does it mean that I engage in jihad? What does that mean?
It can take any number of forms. There is a definite correlation that nobody wants to admit between devoutness in Islam and jihad terror activity. This doesn't mean that every devout Muslim is a jihad terrorist or will ever become one, but every jihad terrorist is a devout Muslim. And this has been hotly disputed, but it's hotly disputed on false pretenses. For example, a few years back, there was a great deal made of the fact that a couple of ISIS terrorists who had gone to Iraq from Britain ordered from Amazon the book Quran for Dummies. And people pointed to this and said, see, they don't know anything about Islam. They're trying to learn about Islam. These people aren't Muslims. Well, in reality, ISIS, the entity that they had gone to, they would hold Quran memorization contests, reward people for knowing Quran, emphasize knowing the Quran. Who knows why these men ordered this book? Maybe it was for somebody else that they knew that they were going to give it to, or maybe that they felt a deficiency in their own knowledge. But it certainly doesn't mean that jihad terrorists are not devout Muslims. To a man, they are. And we also see that there are many, many, many cases of non-devout Muslims who go through a crisis in their lives, and like so many people of all faiths, decide to grow more religious and to try to get beyond the crisis, and they ultimately turn to jihad violence. Mike Hawash is an example. He was an Intel executive out in Oregon, and he was making $360,000 a year, had a wife and kids, was very well respected in the community. And at a certain point, he after 9/11, grew his beard out, began to wear kaftan, to go to the mosque all the time, ultimately served 7 years for recruiting for Al-Qaeda. There was a young student in North Carolina, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he was dissipating in all the ways that students in college often do. He got disgusted with himself, decided he was going to learn about his religion, bought a Quran. Ultimately, he rented an SUV and drove it onto campus to try to kill as many students as possible, running them over.
All right, let me take, I have debated this, and here is a response that many Muslims give, and that is that explain, Dennis, or not even Muslims, Westerners who defend Islam against these statements, they will say, so explain this. Why, if that's the case, why is this terror so new? Muslims weren't doing this in the 1960s, 50s, 40s, 30s, 10s. So it's new. That's their argument.
Some of the tactics are new, but one of the things that I show in the book is that terror is by no means new, that terror is as old as Islam. And I have stories from the fabled, tolerant, pluralistic Muslim Spain, where some of the rulers, Abdurrahman III, he at one point took 130 Christian prisoners out of the prison and crucified them. If that's not terror, I don't know what is. These tactics of suicide bombing, of course, were not available in the 8th century or the 9th century or the 10th century simply because the technology wasn't there. But the assassins, the famous Hashishin, would go and were trained by an Islamic imam to go and to murder specific people, usually political leaders.
All right, hold on there. We'll be back in a moment. I'm speaking to Robert Spencer, The History of Jihad. It's up at my website. I'm Dennis Prager, and I'm speaking with and to Robert Spencer. The book, History of Jihad, just came out 2 days ago, talking about the aim of jihad, and it is to bring the world under Sharia, Islamic law. But it can be waged peacefully or with violence. Is that correct? I want to summarize correctly here. Oh, I didn't put you on. That was a boo-boo. 1 second, Robert. Okay, back to you. Yes. Did I summarize it correctly?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And yet this distinction is lost on many people. A lot of, even in the government, they think, well, if they're not violent, then we can do business with them. This was the Obama understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood. But the Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated to establishing Sharia just as much as violent jihad groups are. They just are generally, not even universally, nonviolent. And so many people were saying, see, these people are moderates. We can play ball with them, completely ignoring the fact that they had exactly the same goal as the violent jihadi.
Right. That I want to make clear to people that's the issue. The issue is Sharia. If Muslims simply wanted everybody to believe in Allah and the Quran and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, that would not be a problem. Tell me if you agree with me. The problem is that the aim is to have us all governed by a totalitarian system.
Oh, yeah, that is exactly it. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, he said, first you invite the unbelievers to accept Islam. If they refuse it, you invite them to pay the jizya, which is the tax that is signifies the dhimmi status, the second-class status. And if they refuse both, then seek Allah's help and fight them. And when you fight them, you are fighting to either bring them into Islam or dhimmitude. Maududi, Sayyid Abu Allah Maududi was a Pakistani politician and Islamic scholar in the 20th century. He died in 1979. And he wrote that non-Muslims have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, the Muslims have the obligation to dislodge them from that power by any means possible.
So again, for the sake of clarity, I would like to draw a distinction here. The Christian aim is that everyone come to Christ. The Muslim aim is that everybody come to Allah and Muhammad. So one might argue, what's the difference? Christians want everybody Christian, Muslims want everybody Muslim. But there is a difference, and the difference is if everybody becomes Christian, you don't have a government enforcing Christian law. Because there isn't Christian law to enforce to begin with, as there is with Sharia, which governs every part of life. Is that a fair distinction?
Absolutely, yes. Most people do not realize that Islam, besides being a religion, is a political system. And that political system it bills itself as being the only legitimate political system for all of the earth. And it's an authoritarian, supremacist, violent, aggressive, and expansionist political system, and consequently it threatens every other political system.
Right. So so that's the Sharia really is the difference. So now I don't know your opinion on this. This will interest me greatly. There are a handful of Muslims, or maybe more than a handful, who are trying to reform Islam. And in my way of thinking, there's one thing that needs to be reformed overwhelmingly, and that is the goal of everybody being governed by Sharia. If Sharia were personal, in other words, I'm a Muslim, I want to govern my life by Muslim law, that's fine. Can a Muslim, in your opinion, a devout Muslim, say we will keep Sharia, or we will transform Sharia into personal law and not seek to make it societal?
Sharia is a unified whole, and the personal law that governs Islamic religious observance is part of it, as well as the material about how a society is to be governed. It's not separable. And so people, they would be accused by their fellow Muslims, and are accused by their fellow Muslims, of having abandoned Sharia and thus having abandoned Allah and Islam, because they are actually rejecting what is part of Sharia.
So it's the reform that I just mentioned is, in your view, impossible.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's impossible, because history is full of so many things nobody ever expected. But I don't see how it could possibly work. And it's very difficult to see a way forward for a non-literal understanding of the Quran to become paramount, when the Quran itself says that the religion is perfected in chapter 5, verse 3. How do you reform what's perfect? And the reformers also have been persecuted as heretics and executed as a result throughout Islamic history.
Is there a way a devout Muslim can condemn Islamic terror?
Well, it's very difficult because you're talking about people who are waging jihad for the sake of Allah, which is something that is greatly
all right, but
rewarded
what is okay? Forgive me, but what is the jihadi end? If the end is bring the world under Sharia, how is that?
Well, a devout Muslim can't condemn that.
Okay, no, I know. So this is my question. Can't a devout Muslim say, yes, we want everybody to accept Sharia, whether through force or through voluntary conversion, but you're mowing down Frenchmen with an SUV in Nice, France, doesn't further that. Can a devout Muslim say that? We'll be back in a moment. Robert Spencer is my guest. The book is The History of Jihad, and it is up at DennisPrager.com.
Whatever may come, the world keeps revolving. They say the next big thing is here.
All right, everybody. Dennis Prager here. Robert Spencer is my guest. The History of Jihad is his book. And I'm glad we have a devout Muslim calling in from Orange County, California. Zia, thank you for calling. You're on with Robert Spencer, and I'm Dennis Prager. Hi.
Hi, Dennis. First, I want to thank you because I'm a long-time listener of you for probably 20 or 25 years.
Wow.
I'm in sales. I drive all day, and I listen to you, and you have made me to be a better Muslim. You enhanced my religion. So I want to thank you first, and
thank you.
It's an honor to be talking to you. But I'm a devout Muslim. I pray 5 times a day, and I condemn violence done by the name of Islam. I mean, based on my understanding from Quran, you can't hurt anybody, and you're supposed to be living in peace amongst your people you live in. And then what your guest was saying that around Prophet's time, Prophet never had any offensive war against anybody. Most of the wars at the beginning were all defensive. And as long as the history that I know, the Prophet lived with all the Jews and Christians in peace and loved with them and brought them and invited them in the mosque to share the mosque with them. So it was a very peaceful coexisting. And I think my opinion, because I've lived in the United States for the past 30-some years, and the major issues that have come up is because of the religion that was twisted and tweaked by the Wahhabism created by Saudi Arabia in the past 35 years. That has really, really caused a lot of problems.
Zia, by the way, Zia, where are you originally from?
I'm from Afghanistan.
Okay, great.
I was born in Afghanistan.
All right.
Came in 1980 when the Soviet. I love you
yes.
because you're the person who fought communism. So I love you.
Yes, I did a lot for Afghanistan. It didn't work out, unfortunately.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate all
Okay, thank you. Please respond. You don't have a lot of time. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, unfortunately, Muhammad actually encountered 3 Jewish tribes in Medina. He exiled 2 of them and massacred the 3rd. Then he went to the oasis of Khaybar, where the 2 tribes that he had exiled were, and massacred them. And he tried to wage war against the Christians of the Byzantine Empire, but didn't find them there when he went. And later on, of course, his followers poured out of Arabia into the Middle East and North Africa in clearly offensive wars and conquered and Islamized the entire region. Throughout history, Muslims have waged jihad violence, as I show in the book. This is not because they all misunderstood Islam. This is because violence is enshrined in the core text. The Quran says, kill them wherever you find them 3 times. Chapter 2, verse 191, 489, and 95.
Robert Spencer's book is The History of Jihad. I thank you, Zia. I thank you as well. I'd like to have a wonderful dialogue between the 2 of you. One day we'll do that. I'm Dennis Prager. Thank you for listening.
The Dennis Prager Show, live from the Relief Factor Pain-Free Studio.